One of my clients recently confessed to me about his avoidant tendencies. He couldn't speak freely to me, face to face, so I suggested he write me an email and confess his feelings if that makes him more comfortable. And that's exactly what he did. He wrote me an email confession that he was completely aware of his actions and the aftermath that followed. What I read in that email was so cold, so calculated, and yet so interesting that I was very fascinated by his words. These weren't the typical, "I'm scared of intimacy" explanations we usually hear. These were cold, strategic admissions about how they actually think and operate in relationships. Prepare yourself, because this is going to shatter every sympathetic narrative you've ever heard about avoidant partners. The calculated nature of their emotional distance. The first confession that stopped me cold was their admission that emotional distance isn't unconscious self-protection. It's a deliberate strategy to maintain control. This person wrote about consciously calculating how much emotional availability to provide to keep their partner invested without requiring genuine vulnerability from themselves. They described relationships like a business transaction where they determined the minimum emotional investment needed to maintain access to their partner's resources, emotional support, physical intimacy, practical assistance, and social benefits. They had actually developed a mental formula for how much affection to show, how often to be emotionally available, and when to withdraw to maintain their partner's anxiety and investment. What made this particularly disturbing was their clinical detachment in describing their partner's emotional reactions. They wrote about watching their partner cry after being emotionally rejected and feeling nothing except mild irritation that they had to deal with the drama. They described their partner's pain as an inconvenience rather than something that affected them emotionally. The confession revealed that they kept detailed mental notes about what triggered their partner's insecurities and deliberately used this information to maintain control. When their partner started pulling away or setting boundaries, they would strategically provide just enough emotional connection to reel them back in, then return to their baseline emotional unavailability once their partner was sufficiently reinvested. They admitted to finding their partner's emotional neediness simultaneously useful and contemptible. Useful because it made them easy to manipulate and control. Contemptible because they viewed emotional needs as weakness that they could exploit. The level of conscious manipulation was breathtaking and completely contradicted the narrative of avoidance as wounded souls struggling with intimacy. Their secret contempt for their partners. Perhaps the most shocking revelation was their deep, hidden contempt for partners who tolerated their emotional unavailability. They wrote about losing respect for anyone who would accept their minimal emotional investment, viewing their partner's patience and understanding as pathetic rather than admirable. They described feeling disgusted by their partner's attempts to create emotional intimacy, seeing vulnerability as weakness and emotional expression as embarrassing neediness. They wrote about internally mocking their partner's efforts to connect while maintaining a facade of appreciation for their understanding nature. The confession revealed that they specifically sought out partners with anxious attachment because these individuals would tolerate emotional starvation while continuing to provide emotional resources. They had learned to identify the signs of anxious attachment and deliberately targeted these individuals because they were easier to control and less likely to enforce boundaries. What was most disturbing was their admission that they enjoyed watching their partner struggle with uncertainty about the relationship. They found satisfaction in their partner's anxiety because it confirmed their control over the relationship dynamic. Their partner's emotional suffering was entertainment rather than something that concerned them. They wrote about feeling superior to their partner because of their emotional detachment, viewing their inability to form deep connections as strength rather than limitation. They saw their partner's capacity for love and vulnerability as inferior traits that made them weak and exploitable. The strategic use of intermittent reinforcement. The confession included detailed descriptions of how they used intermittent reinforcement to create addiction-like patterns in their partners. They had consciously studied psychological principles and applied them to maintain their partner's emotional dependence while minimizing their own investment. They described deliberately alternating between emotional availability and withdrawal to create what they called emotional confusion in their partner. They knew exactly how long they could withdraw before their partner would start pulling away, and they would return with just enough attention to reset the cycle. The most chilling aspect was their description of monitoring their partner's emotional state, like a scientist observing a lab rat. They tracked their partner's responses to different behaviors and adjusted their strategy accordingly to maintain optimal control with minimal effort. They wrote about timing their emotional availability to coincide with their partner's lowest points, providing comfort when their partner was most vulnerable, and then withdrawing once their partner felt stable again. This created a cycle where their partner associated them with relief from pain they were actually causing. They admitted to deliberately creating problems in the relationship just so they could occasionally solve them, making their partner grateful for basic relationship behaviors that should have been consistent. They would withdraw affection, create insecurity, then provide reassurance, making their partner feel grateful for temporary relief from manufactured anxiety. Their view of love as a weakness to exploit. One of the most disturbing confessions was their view of their partner's love as a weakness that could be exploited rather than a gift to be treasured. They wrote about feeling nothing when their partner expressed love, seeing these declarations as evidence of their partner's emotional dependency rather than genuine connection. They described love as a tool that others used to manipulate them, never recognizing it as authentic emotion. They believed that anyone who claimed to love them was either lying to get something from them or was pathetically desperate for approval. They couldn't conceive of love as genuine care for another person's well-being. The confession revealed that they viewed their partner's emotional investment as leverage they could use to get what they wanted. The deeper their partner's feelings, the more power they felt they had to control the relationship without reciprocating emotional investment. They admitted to saying, "I love you," strategically, rather than emotionally, using these words to maintain their partner's investment when they sensed their partner pulling away. They had no emotional connection to these words. They were simply tools for manipulation and control. Most shockingly, they wrote about feeling annoyed when their partner expressed hurt about their emotional unavailability because it required them to provide reassurance they didn't want to give. They saw their partner's emotional needs as demands on their time and energy, rather than legitimate relationship requirements. The premeditated nature of their relationship patterns. What became clear from these confessions was that nothing about their relationship behavior was unconscious or trauma-based. It was all premeditated and strategic. They had consciously developed these patterns because they worked to get their needs met while avoiding emotional investment. They described studying relationship advice not to improve their capacity for intimacy, but to better understand how to manipulate their partners. They read about attachment styles to identify targets and refine their manipulation strategies, rather than to heal their own emotional limitations. The confession included detailed descriptions of how they maintained multiple potential partners simultaneously, keeping backup options available while ensuring their primary partner never felt completely secure. They managed these multiple connections like a portfolio, investing just enough in each to maintain availability without committing fully to anyone. They wrote about planning their exits from relationships months in advance, gradually reducing emotional investment while maintaining their partner's hope until they found a suitable replacement. They never ended relationships cleanly. They always kept doors open in case they needed to return for resources or comfort. Most disturbing was their admission that they had refined these patterns over multiple relationships, learning from each partner what worked to maintain control with minimal effort. Each relationship was a laboratory where they tested and improved their manipulation techniques. Their complete lack of empathy. Throughout these confessions, what struck me most was the complete absence of empathy for their partner's experience. They wrote about their partner's emotional pain with the same detachment they might describe the weather, observable but completely irrelevant to their own experience. They described watching their partner cry and feeling only irritation that they had to interrupt their activities to provide minimal comfort. They saw their partner's emotional reactions as inconveniences rather than responses to legitimate relationship problems they were creating. They admitted to feeling nothing when their partner expressed hurt, fear, or loneliness related to their emotional unavailability. These emotions simply didn't register as important or worthy of consideration in their decision-making process. The confession revealed that they viewed their partner's attempts to discuss relationship problems as attacks on their autonomy rather than legitimate efforts to improve their connection. They saw any request for greater emotional availability as unreasonable demands they had to strategically deflect. Most chillingly, they wrote about ending the relationship not because they felt guilty about the pain they were causing, but because maintaining the manipulation had become more work than they wanted to invest. Their partner's emotional suffering was irrelevant. Their own convenience was the only factor that mattered. The predatory selection of partners. These confessions revealed a predatory approach to partner selection that was both calculated and disturbing. They described specifically seeking out partners who showed signs of low self-esteem, anxious attachment, or previous relationship trauma, because these individuals were easier to control and manipulate. They had learned to identify people who would tolerate emotional breadcrumbs while providing consistent emotional support. They looked for partners who had histories of trying to fix or help emotionally unavailable people, because these individuals would interpret their emotional limitations as challenges to overcome rather than incompatibilities to avoid. The confession included descriptions of how they presented themselves differently during the initial courtship phase, providing higher levels of emotional availability to secure their partner's attachment before gradually reducing their emotional investment. This bait and switch strategy was completely conscious and premeditated. They wrote about studying their target's previous relationships to understand what emotional wounds they could exploit. They positioned themselves as different from their partner's previous experiences while actually being worse, because their emotional unavailability was conscious and strategic, rather than unconscious and trauma-based. Most disturbing was their admission that they enjoyed the process of gradually breaking down their partner's boundaries and self-respect. They saw their partner's increasing tolerance for poor treatment as evidence of their skill at psychological manipulation rather than something that should concern them. Their justification system. What made these confessions particularly disturbing was the elaborate justification system this person had developed to rationalize their behavior. They had convinced themselves that their manipulation was actually beneficial to their partners because it taught them to be more independent and less emotionally needy. They wrote about viewing their emotional unavailability as a gift that would help their partner develop self-reliance and emotional strength. They saw themselves as tough love teachers rather than manipulative partners, completely ignoring the psychological damage they were causing. They justified their behavior by claiming that their partners chose to stay, interpreting their partner's trauma, bonding, and attachment as evidence that the relationship was mutually beneficial. They used their partner's inability to leave as proof that their treatment wasn't actually harmful. The confession revealed that they blamed their partners for allowing themselves to be treated poorly, claiming that anyone who tolerated their behavior deserved whatever emotional damage resulted. They had completely inverted responsibility, making their victims accountable for their own victimization. Most sickeningly, they wrote about feeling proud of their ability to maintain relationships while providing minimal emotional investment, seeing this as evidence of their superior emotional intelligence rather than their lack of empathy and human decency. The long-term damage they cause. These confessions made clear that the damage caused by consciously manipulative avoidance extends far beyond the immediate relationship. They described observing their ex-partner's struggles with future relationships and feeling satisfied that they had permanently altered their partner's capacity to trust and love. They wrote about their ex-partners developing anxiety disorders, depression, and complex trauma responses that persisted long after the relationship ended. They viewed this ongoing psychological damage as evidence of their lasting impact rather than something that should concern them. The confession revealed that they kept track of their ex-partners through social media, feeling gratified when they saw signs of continued emotional struggles. They interpreted their ex-partners' difficulties with future relationships as proof of their own irreplaceable impact. They admitted to occasionally reaching out to ex-partners during vulnerable moments, not out of genuine care, but to test whether they could still manipulate their emotions. They used their ex-partner's continued responsiveness as validation of their manipulation skills. Most disturbing was their description of how they had damaged their partner's ability to recognize healthy love when it was offered. Their partners had become so conditioned to emotional starvation that consistent emotional availability felt overwhelming or suspicious. The impossibility of change. Perhaps the most hopeless aspect of these confessions was this person's complete lack of interest in changing their behavior patterns. They didn't see their emotional limitations as problems to be solved, but as effective strategies to be maintained and refined. They wrote about attending therapy, not to develop empathy or emotional availability, but to learn better manipulation techniques and gain credibility with partners who wanted them to work on themselves. They had learned therapeutic language without developing any genuine insight or motivation for change. The confession revealed that they had no internal motivation to develop emotional capacity because their current patterns met all their needs while requiring minimal investment. They saw no benefit to emotional vulnerability or genuine intimacy that would justify the effort required to develop these capacities. They admitted that they would only consider changing their behavior if their manipulation techniques stopped working, not because they developed concern for their partner's well-being. Their only motivation for potential change was pragmatic rather than moral or emotional. Most chillingly, they wrote about feeling contempt for people who suggested they needed to change, viewing these suggestions as evidence that others didn't understand their superior approach to relationships. They saw their emotional limitations as advantages rather than problems requiring solutions. The warning signs you need to recognize. These confessions revealed specific warning signs that indicate you're dealing with a consciously manipulative avoidant rather than someone genuinely struggling with intimacy fears. These individuals often present as more self-aware and emotionally intelligent than typical avoidants because they've studied psychology to improve their manipulation techniques. They frequently use therapeutic language and concepts to justify their behavior while showing no genuine emotional growth or increased empathy. They may discuss their attachment patterns intellectually without demonstrating any real vulnerability or commitment to change. They often maintain multiple relationships or connections simultaneously while making their primary partner feel special for being chosen. They create artificial scarcity around their attention while ensuring they always have backup options available. Most importantly, they show patterns of escalating emotional withdrawal that coincides with their partner's increasing investment rather than random approach avoidance cycles. Their emotional unavailability becomes more pronounced as their partner becomes more attached, revealing the strategic nature of their behavior. The reality you must accept. These confessions force us to confront a disturbing reality. Some individuals who present as avoidant are actually emotional predators who consciously exploit others' capacity for love and attachment. They're not wounded souls struggling with intimacy. They're calculating manipulators who use others' emotional needs as leverage for control. The most important lesson from these confessions is that not all avoidant behavior stems from trauma or fear. Some individuals choose emotional unavailability because it serves their psychological and practical needs while requiring no reciprocal investment or personal growth. If you recognize these patterns in your relationship, the person you're dealing with is not someone who can be healed through love, patience, or understanding. They're someone who is consciously choosing to exploit your emotional generosity for their own benefit, while feeling no concern for the damage they cause. The only appropriate response to recognizing these patterns is immediate disengagement and protection of your own emotional well-being. These individuals cannot be fixed, healed, or loved into empathy because their behavior is chosen rather than compulsive. These confessions revealed the darkest possible interpretation of avoidant attachment, not as unconscious self-protection, but as conscious predation disguised as emotional limitation. Understanding this distinction could save you years of wasted effort and protect you from psychological damage that may take years to heal.